Welcome to the Cyber Insider, Emsisoft podcast all about cybersecurity. Your host today are Brett Callow, threat analyst here at Emsisoft, and I'm Luke Connolly, partner manager. Our guest today is Azim Khodjibaev. Mr. Khodjibaev is a senior intelligence analyst with Cisco Talos threat intelligence and interdiction team. With over a decade in intelligence analysis experience, Azim is focused on Russian APT and cybercrime activity for the past 8 years. He's worked on many ransomware-related projects and has experience with direct adversary engagement. Azim, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us. Perhaps you could start by fleshing out that bio a little. What does your typical day look like, and what on earth is an interdiction team?
There. My day starts with something that my parents said would never happen, and that is checking the computer or phone, some sort of screen device, for messages and just being on the internet. That usually involves with some sort of notifications about some sort of negative or bad thing that occurred, and every so often some sort of good or positive thing that occurred. But it involves it starts with information, and requires a lot of caffeine at this stage in my life. The interdiction part, it's very important, and I think leadership and essentially when they started the team intended for this. We strive to not only collect and analyze intelligence and protect our customers that way, we also strive to interdict. Okay, so I don't tend to use the word within the definition, but we try to prevent threats and attacks any way possible. And one of the first approaches that Cisco Talos developed was developing partnerships across the entire cybersecurity spectrum, including public and private partnerships. And we intended for that to be a mechanism to engage key critical partners that could actually do something about bad things. And that includes ISPs, that includes hosting providers, that includes law enforcement agencies, that includes intelligence agencies, that includes nonprofit organizations that could nudge and push policy one way or the other and help prevent attacks that we see every single day.
You're fairly well known to the bad guys because you spend time engaging with them. How useful is this, and what sort of intel have you been able to gather?
Just in short, it's very useful, and I can explain why. When I started at Cisco Talos, I joined a team full of very brilliant people that understood how to prevent attacks on a physical level, on the router level, on the network level, on the machine level, and detection and signatures and antivirus mechanisms were all there. And the next level of enhanced security was going deeper and understanding the cybercriminal mind. And the job, in a way, kind of found me because I wasn't particularly skilled or don't have a computer science background. And that is trying to understand the behavioral side of the cybercriminal landscape. The direct engagement turned to be fruitful early on, because no matter what a criminal, a persona, or a group tries to do, at the end of the day, my argument is that they're human beings. And the more you interact and engage with human beings, you see the human side of them. And that human side reveals a lot about their motivations, about their pragmatic or non-pragmatic approach to things, how they view the world. And it shapes a certain profile that helps us understand where these motivations are coming from and how they work and what trust is built among these groups and how you can undermine that trust to further disrupt or interdict their operations.
Let's talk about some of the events and trends that we've seen this year.
Yeah.
In terms of breaches, probably Move It and Go Anywhere are amongst the most significant. What were the takeaways from that? What can we do to prevent those incidents in the future?
I'll start off with answering that part first. It seems like those incidents were directly related to zero-day vulnerabilities that were abused in the wild before the good guys even knew about them, and perhaps some good guys did know about them and just were out of the loop somewhere down the road of the development of the product. Sometimes the product you think is super safe and it's not. And it was clear that somebody's sophisticated enough, which this does take a certain level of sophistication, as I mentioned, those computer science degrees, figured out that there are vulnerabilities in those products. What's interesting is those products, particularly from what I recall, are related to data management, from what I understand. And it seemed like there was a narrowed focus on those particular products and looking for vulnerabilities in those things. So to me, that says there was a more of a targeted attack that had probably more layers to it than just financial gain. It's still, the verdict is still out on why. Obviously, there haven't been major conclusions. But from what I understood is the bad guys that are behind it is, I think, Clop, ransomware, formerly ransomware group, data extortion group now, either has access to a developer that is able to find these vulnerabilities or has access to somebody that has access to that developer. But nevertheless, they're somewhere along that chain of having that access, and they seem to have exclusive access to that developer that is finding these vulnerabilities and is allowing them to go after a large set of victims and steal their data for further abuse.
You said that the motivations may not be purely financial. Can you elaborate on that?
Right. In my experience, and again, these could be anecdotal, I'll definitely note that the cost for a financially motivated cyber criminal kind of is heavily considered in operations. From looking at this particular group, Clop, it seems like they have access to somebody that I would argue is more expensive, or at least has more ability to charge more, if you will, for their time and dedication, even if it's a third party reseller of information. Let's just hypothetically speak, there's no evidence of that, as far as I know. That person still would have considerable unique data access that they would probably charge more. So the operational cost behind that immediately reveals that there's some sort of heavy investment in that. Now, you could argue, I'm sure, that the investment cost, the return on investment, is big when you go after such a large set of victims that end up paying the stuff. But what's missing about this is the unique aspect of, encryption, which is a method of putting pressure on the victim. And I'm not really sure. Obviously, the group came out recently or a few years ago. I'm not really sure when, and they said that they weren't going to do that anymore as far as encrypting networks. But to me, there's some sort of missing piece about actually getting the money. While they do that, it just stands out that there's just too much investment in activity and access that would just be solely for making a quick buck.
The MGM breach that happened earlier this year, Alfie was collaborating with native English speaking threat actors. Apparently, does that matter? What's the impact of that? What does that mean for us?
I noticed that came out that they came up earlier this year. There seemed to be individuals that hopped on the Alfie or Alpha brand and leveraged that brand for data extortion, or just extortion, excuse me. Uh, what could that mean? There's many different ways. It could mean that particularly Alpha was maybe suffering from the ability for, to gain affiliates and payouts, and was desperate enough to attract folks that are not a part of the traditional Russian cybercriminal environment. It could also mean that there was some sort of ulterior motive by these English-speaking groups to maybe enter the group and learn from them, which is kind of far-fetched, I guess, but it's still possible. There's also speculation that the Alpha for itself just leased their brand out to anybody and whoever wants in, private channels. And for a fee, anybody could just go ahead and use their platform to post a victim, which was interesting because now they're just using their brand. They did a little bit of brand developing and then charged money for distribution. Really, it's like a label, right? So it's a lucrative way to make a quick buck, but it seemed like it ultimately undermined them because, given the recent interdiction by law enforcement on Alpha's blog and the alleged theft, or not theft, excuse me, alleged, how would you say this, obtaining of encryption keys, decryption keys by law enforcement. There is speculation that these English-speaking lower skilled threat actors that joined Alpha were actually the gateway for law enforcement to enter the Alpha environment, and ultimately lead to interdiction. I have no idea if that is true or not, but certainly there's chatter about it from on Russian hacking forums.
At one point, it seemed that the ransomware as a service model could be going away, and now maybe it isn't. What do you make of what's happening and what may happen in the months ahead?
There was a lot of speculation, I think, in 2022 and 2021 that could actually that I agree with you that there was a prediction that the ransomware would actually diminish, and we saw a major return of that in 2023. I think a lot of cyber criminal groups that work in the ransomware space learned that there is certainly a law enforcement reaction or a bigger policy reaction, bigger public reaction to some of the attacks that they do. And they've tested the waters in doing data extortion, but perhaps they learned in the meantime during that testing that the payouts are lower, the responses are lower, and it's not actually as lucrative as one would think. So a lot of them went back to the traditional pressure method and encryption, perhaps threatening of DDoSing, and even threatening of leaking personal information, such as these English speakers from Alpha were threatening to leak, and I think actually did leak nudes of somebody, of a victim. I would guess that there was some sort of significant change in how payouts were made, maybe at the same time. and that has led to, again, putting pressure on the victim. So I don't think ransomware is going away anytime soon. I think it's quite the opposite. I think a lot more people are going to get into this space, and it's not just going to be your traditional Russian-speaking cyber criminals, Chinese-speaking cyber criminals. I think it's going to become more globalized, and I think it's going to be more fluid, and I think it's going to be harder to understand who's behind these certain groups. I personally think we're just on the tip of the iceberg of how bad this is going to get, and the impact it will have on the next generation, who I would argue is a lot less, who grew up in a very paywalled environment thanks to Apple and Android and Microsoft's attempts to just kind of keep them all in a bubble. I think it's going to be a problem for decades to come. One form of ransomware or another.
So interesting, because this year we saw some success from law enforcement with the takedown of Hive and recently with Alpha. But as you sort of mentioned with your belief that the worst is yet to come, there's still debate about what the impact of these law enforcement activities and actions will actually have on the cyber criminals and their activities. What's your take? Does taking down a website or disrupting some revenue flow, is that going to have an impact? Is that going to minimize future activity by these groups?
I do think so. I think it's very much worth in investing in disruption and interdiction. I think it does have an impact, even if it buys time, even if it forces criminals to go into the underground, and or imposes cost on their operation, and eventually bleeds them out or forces them to consolidate and lose power, etc. This is very much similar to, unfortunately, in my opinion, to these major policies that look like the war on drugs or the war on terror and the war on these other non-tangible things, because you can't really see the success of it. You just have to dedicate your bureaucracy and your mindset to fighting that fight as long as it takes. And sometimes you will have big major disruptive operations like the taking down of big major terrorist cells and learning from that, or sometimes you will see that there's the ability of them doing damage is so low cost for them, and their ability for them to organize quickly is going to blindside an organization or a government. It's very, very hard, to predict those. But when you dedicate resources to it, at the very least, I think you're at least are able to layer it for what I say is what's next, what's going to come next, right? You don't want to just build up this entire security apparatus because it got so bad. And unfortunately, that's kind of how it is in many ways. But right now, fighting and learning how to disrupt and learning how these guys work and learning where they go to after they disrupt is a huge value to that. At the very least, we can minimize the noise. We can minimize, like, I understand the war on drugs. You minimize the amount of drugs that hit the street and impact society. You minimize the amount of weapons that go into places that are known traditionally for terror operations. So you just try to minimize and I guess compartmentalize, if you will, these activities enough to where they're not taking down major economic activity or schools or infrastructure or impacting hospitals, things like that, to the scale of like major massive disruption to the way we live is happening. That's what I would think that's why I think it's just worth the investment.
In the case of Citrix Bleed, it seems a lot of the compromises happened after Citrix had already released a patch. How can we deal with that issue? How can we get companies to patch more quickly? Or can't we? Do we have to try and somehow eliminate the need for patching?
Boy, these are tough policy questions. I'm always of the mindset of being kind and proactive. I don't think we need to scare companies with fines or some sort of list of bad companies that don't patch or any kind of negativity into this space. Nevertheless, you got to hold certain people accountable to managing very vulnerable and data that could be abused and weaponized in many different ways. So paying attention to that and categorizing, I think, is the first step, and then encouragement, which I think many of us do, is the second step. But ultimately, I'm not sure if it's worth to have some sort of shame, which I kind of, as I said, personally against, for companies that don't follow this. It's very, very difficult to work in this space when the final step, the final mile, is negligent, because people that are responsible for so much value into the company are not responsible enough to do the basic things like patch or stay on top of information that tells them things like to patch certain things. And unfortunately, I've seen instances even with direct victim notifications, the responses can be slow, and I just can't. I can't think in that mindset, because my mindset is just seeing so much danger all the time that it seems it's almost subjective, and I almost give up in a certain sense that changing their mind, it's hard for somebody like me until it's too late, and it's very, very sad.
Okta, a US-based company, was hacked. It announced in November that it had been hacked a couple of months previously, and that the hackers stole information on all of its users from its customer support system. Can you tell us what happened and why it matters? Are you familiar with that incident at all?
I'm not terribly familiar with that incident, so I wouldn't want to speculate too much. I know that when companies get breached, the first thing that's on their mind is obviously how bad it is, right? And as a company that did get breached, Cisco was a victim of a data extortion group that also attempted to deploy ransomware. It was a very, very difficult moment, but being as forthcoming during that time pays off so much in the long run. It builds trust, not only from the community, which everybody is afraid of for some reason, but it builds trust from the customer. And that's important. It's important when you're in a business that relies on customer money. So I'm not really sure if there was some sort of delay in sharing of information. Again, I'm not too familiar with the process, but if I could take away one thing, is the earlier and the more concise information you can provide to everybody involved, the better. It's not something you should be afraid of. And there are typically groups within organizations. Sometimes it's counsel, sometimes perhaps it's people from the insurance side, sometimes it's people from your own incident response that tend to influence that process to keep the information controlled and hidden. But I'm of the mindset and of the experience that the more you share, the more confidence you'll build in the long run and are able to provide protection further.
From a policy perspective, what do you think governments should be doing that they aren't currently doing?
There are many things. I think I'll beat a dead horse by saying engagement and developing partnerships. Everybody understands that is something that we should be doing, and everybody's probably working one way or the other to do that, working on that. And that's what I'm talking about, is direct engagement with the private sector about the things that they see, and vice versa. I think we should probably go away from the argument that the public side does not provide us anybody, or that they've long gone from that, and they've been very open about it in many different ways. what policy-wise can we do? There's a lot of proactive things that we do, and I think it's education and not educating corporate side, not educating IT departments or anything like that. I think they understand the problem. It's educating the future mindset of the entire populace. Like, it would be really nice to see middle school classes, for example, about online safety and literally talk about what ransomware is and what phishing is and identity management, multi-factor authentication, and not just leave it to little tiny pieces of a very focused part of the school where there's like computer science classes and things like that where they discuss this, but treat it as bad as we treat all the other safety stuff, drugs, for example, the health aspect of, that we learn in physical education classes about, nutrition, about treating our bodies with respect and clean and all those other things. I think I think the government could do a huge amount of good in providing resources at the very least and encouraging the education sector on any level to really put that secure mindset uh, into the next generation. I think it's imperative because the amount of devices that these people have, the next generation, including us, is just it's exponentially growing, and they're reliant on it way more than we are, and way more than the generation before us. And they're just going to be interacting and living in it and dedicating so much of their life to it, so much of their data to it, way more than us. And we're probably already are oversaturated with it. So I just am baffled that things like, for example, not clicking on a malicious link is still not taught at some sort of level. And perhaps some school districts are, but on a national level, and at the very least in the States, it's not discussed at all. I'm afraid it might even be politicized in one way or the other.
I think we're going to release this podcast early in 2024. So looking back on 2023, in your mind, what really stood out? Have there been any trends or any sort of general direction that the cyber criminals have been taking? What can we take away from this year in terms of the activity of the bad guys?
One thing I think I saw that stood out was the splintering of groups and how quickly they can splinter off and switch groups and work, be an affiliate with 3 or 4 different ransomware groups. We saw a lot of that in 2022 starting up. We saw a little bit of that the year before, but now it seems like you don't really have to dedicate yourself to any particular brand. The environment itself is established to where they can go to many different groups quickly, right? And um, that's one thing. And then you can spin up a ransomware group, like it seems like within 24 hours. Not sure how effective they are or not, but they're not like these big overarching groups like we saw with Conti that was huge. It had a lot of affiliates. It had a huge back end business operation as far as providing human resource support. Now, or this particular year, we saw a lot of these groups pop up out of nowhere. Well, not really out of nowhere. Some of them revealed themselves with tactics, and then they disappear into the void, or they stop activity, and just kind of many people lose attention to them. I don't know if that's a trend or not. I don't know if it's a response to interdiction, but there was more interdiction this year. That's another big thing that stood out. We started off with a huge bang with the taking down of Hive servers, and then continued on. Then the FBI made a big splashy indictment against Mikhail Matveyev with Wazawaka, which is arguably one of the most prolific ransomware criminals, and put heavy sanctions on him as well. And then we learned that apparently he does not particularly care, and really, really underlined or highlighted the entire impunity argument that exists, that we argue exists in Russia, because it seems like there weren't particularly any consequences we saw legally for him in his own country, even though he's wanted. He's on the FBI's most wanted list. That's just shocking to me. Not surprising, but still kind of shocking.
In the past, cyber criminals did indeed operate with almost complete impunity, but that has started to change a bit in recent years. We are seeing more arrests. What impact do you think that will have on how they operate?
I think there's always a short-term dynamic that I've observed of them kind of stepping back and assessing the danger that's posed to them through that particular operation. But a cyber criminal mind that it's like a drug. I've always, believed that at least if they've tasted the the the, the insatiable drug of making quick buck, even if it's a few tens of thousands of dollars, they're going to come back to it one way or the other. And speaking of Mikhail Matveyev, it would seem that since the release of the sanctions and the indictment, that he would probably lay low and stay away from these activities. But allegations and a recent report from a security company vendor um, made it clear that he has not done that. He continues to be very heavily involved with ransomware and continues to profit from it. But as you can see, he did it in a way to where, cursory look will suggest that he's probably backed off. So my answer is they back off, they figure out what the danger is, and they come back. As long as they have access to a computer, as long as they have access to their communication channels, they're going to come back and they'll do it a little bit better, a little bit more sophisticated. And unfortunately, they do learn from the interdiction process as well.
Looking forward toward 2024, are things going to be better? Is law enforcement, is industry in a better position looking forward to 2024, or are the cyber criminals in a more powerful, in a stronger position, do you think? Is it going to be better or worse?
Yeah, better or worse, I guess, for the general public. It's hard to say. It's really hard to say. I would, if I had to choose, I would say just slightly better. The rate of learning is still pretty high as far as the good side is concerned. About learning to protect itself and others and sharing information and building trust. That inevitably undermines how much bad guys or criminals are able to operate freely or rely on their traditional methods of operations. So it's like this balance argument. So I personally think that what we're doing in general, like not just particularly Cisco Talos, but everybody involved, including Brett, it's helping significantly, and at the very least, it's influencing that mindset that I'm talking about. So I think it's going to get better as far as protections, and we'll see more. I'm sure we'll see more instances where attempts were made to compromise the network, as far as these little anecdotal experiences that many vendors have, attempts to compromise the network, but actual failed attempts. Those instances will rise. We'll also see that bad guys are going to learn, and how they learn is going to be very interesting. So I think that the painting of them into a corner is getting more painted, if you will. It's just not as fast as I'd like.
Finally, a question we put to everyone. If it was within your power to create a law that banned the payment of ransom demands, would you do it?
Just an outright law, full ban on payments.
Full ban.
I'm not ready for that full ban. I'd like to see it, but I'm not ready for it. And this is where a lot of my friends would probably scream that I'm always wishy-washy on these things. Yeah, ultimately, it would be nice to have a full universal ban on ransomware payments. I think that cutting that flow of money would significantly undermine the resources and force them to do something different. Um, Maybe not as lucrative, maybe not as easy resource-wise, but just an overnight ban would be very difficult for me to swallow because I know that it would have effects that maybe even that are unforeseen, even if just thinking about it now, that makes me a little uncomfortable. But ultimately, I would love it. Is that a terrible answer or what? Um, I'll stick to the side of yes. I would like to see an overall ban further down the road that's not as disruptive as an overnight ban.
And with that, I'd like to thank you, Azim, for joining us today. It's been really interesting to hear from your experience with the cyber criminals. And as always, we also thank our listeners for tuning in. To stay up to date on the latest in cybersecurity, be sure to check and subscribe to our podcast. Thanks, Azim.
Thank you.